Imagine stepping back in time, way before dating apps or even lonely hearts. Ads in newspapers. Colonial America, a new world bustling with hope and hardship, had its own unique ways of thinking about single women. Sometimes there seemed to be too many in one place, or not enough in another. Society had strong ideas about where a woman should be, and that was usually married. So, what happened when a woman found herself single? From shiploads of women sailing to new lives to surprising chances for independence, the approaches were as varied as the colonies themselves. Get ready to uncover some little-known facts and intriguing stories about single women in a world very different from our own. Number 10. The Tobacco Brides Scheme. An ocean away for a husband. Picture the early days of Jamestown, Virginia, in the early 1600s. It was a rough place, mostly filled with men looking to make their fortune. The Virginia Company of London, the folks in charge of the colony, quickly realized the big problem. Without women and families, Jamestown was more like a temporary camp than a permanent settlement. Men were lonely, unruly, and not very interested in staying long-term if they could not establish roots. The company needed a way to make the colony more stable and civilized. So they came up with an idea, a very direct one. Starting in 1619, the same year, the first Africans arrived in Virginia. The Virginia Company began to actively recruit and send women from England to Jamestown. These women were not convicts or forced migrants in the same way as some others. They were often young women of modest backgrounds, seeking a better life or, quite frankly, a husband. They were sometimes called tobacco brides because their passage was often paid for by the colonial government or by their future husbands with tobacco, the valuable cash crop of Virginia. Cost was around 120 pounds of tobacco, which was a significant sum. Later, this rose to 150 pounds. The first ship, the Jonathan, arrived in May 1620, carrying around 90 young women. Another ship, the Warwick, brought more. Company advertised for young and uncorrupt maids to make wives for the inhabitants. The idea was that these women would marry the planters, start families, and help create a more settled English society. The company officials believed that virtuous women would turn the wild colonists into responsible citizens. Sir Edwin Sandys, the treasurer of the Virginia Company, was a key promoter of this plan. He wrote in 1620 that the plantation can never flourish till families be planted and the respect of wives and children fix the people on the soil. The women who undertook this journey were taking a huge risk. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and dangerous. Disease was rampant on ships and in the new colony. Once they arrived, they were in a strange, often harsh environment. However, they did have some say in the matter of who they married. According to the Virginia Company's instructions, women were to be housed together upon arrival and not forced to marry against their will. A man who wanted to marry one of these women had to win her consent and also pay the cost of her transportation. This gave the women a degree of choice that might have been unavailable to them in England, especially if they came from poor families where arranged marriages were common. Records suggest that many of these women did marry quickly after arrival. The demand for wives was very high. In 1621, the company sent another 57 women. One of the women, a maid named Temperance Flowerdew, who arrived in 1609 before the main scheme, actually ended up marrying 2 Virginia governors. Others faced much harder lives. The conditions in early Virginia were incredibly tough. Starvation, disease, and conflict with Native Americans were constant threats. The starving time of 1609–1610 had seen the population of Jamestown plummet. While the tobacco brides arrived a decade later, life was still precarious. The numbers of women sent specifically under this bride scheme were not enormous. In the grand scheme of colonial immigration, perhaps a few hundred over several years, their arrival was significant. It marked a conscious effort to correct the gender balance and to build a society based on families. It showed how vital women were considered for the success of the colonial project, even if their primary role was seen as wife and mother. The letters sent back by the Virginia Company emphasized the positive impact of the women, noting that their presence made the men more settled and observant of their duties. This program highlighted a very direct approach to dealing with a perceived surplus of men in one part of the English world, and perhaps a surplus of unmarried women with limited prospects in another. It was a transatlantic transaction of sorts, with women's lives and futures central to the exchange, all in the hope of building a new society from the ground up. Number 9. Pressured into pews and proposals, marry or else. In colonial America, getting married was not just a personal choice. It was a huge social expectation, especially for women. From the moment a girl was old enough to understand, the message was clear. Her destiny was to become a wife and mother. This wasn't just a gentle nudge. It was a powerful force coming from everywhere: the church, the community, the law, and even her own family. For a woman to remain single by choice, or even by circumstance, was unusual and often viewed with suspicion or pity. Religion played a massive role in this. In Puritan New England, for example, marriage was seen as the cornerstone of a godly society. The family was the basic unit of the community, and a well-ordered family was essential for social stability and religious observance. Ministers preached sermons about the virtues of marriage and the duties of husbands and wives. Single individuals, especially as they got older, didn't quite fit this model. They were seen as incomplete or outside the natural order of things. Marriage was considered the normal, expected state for adults. Community itself acted as a constant enforcer of these norms. Everyone knew everyone else's business in the small towns and villages of colonial America. A young woman who was not married by her early 20s would start to attract attention and gossip. She might be asked, perhaps not always kindly, why she was still single. Social events were often geared towards courtship and marriage. If a woman didn't participate or wasn't successful in finding a partner, she could find herself on the margins of social life. There was a very real fear of becoming an old maid, a term that carried a heavy stigma. Pressure wasn't just social and religious, it was also economic. For most women, marriage was the primary path to economic security. Unmarried women had very limited opportunities to earn a living, as we will see later. A husband was expected to provide for his wife and children. Without a husband, a woman was often dependent on her male relatives, like her father or brothers. This dependence could be a heavy burden, both for her and for them. Marriage, therefore, was not just about love or companionship. It was a practical necessity for many women. The average age of marriage for women in colonial America was generally in their early to mid-20s, though it varied by region and time period. In some parts of New England during the 17th century, women married as young as 20 on average, while in the southern colonies it might have been slightly younger. If a woman passed this age without a husband, the pressure would intensify. There were even terms for older unmarried women like spinster, which originally just meant a woman who spins but increasingly came to mean an unmarried woman. Later, less kind terms like thornback could be used for women who remained unmarried past a certain age, typically around 25 or 30. Courtship itself was a serious business. often supervised by family and community. It wasn't the casual dating we know today. It was a clear progression towards marriage. Young people might meet at church, at social gatherings, or through family connections. But once a couple began courting, there was an expectation that it would lead to a proposal. Long, drawn-out courtships, without a clear intention of marriage, were frowned upon. This whole system was designed to funnel young people efficiently into matrimony. What happened if a woman did not marry? Life could be difficult. She might live with her parents until they died. Then, perhaps, move in with a married sibling. She would be expected to help with household chores and childcare, often in a subordinate position. While some single women found fulfilling roles within their extended families or communities, the overarching citable message was that they had missed out on their primary calling. This immense pressure to marry was one of the most fundamental ways colonial society dealt with single women, by trying to ensure there were as few of them as possible. It was a system designed to leave no woman behind, or rather, no woman unmarried. Number 8. Spinster taxes and bachelor fines. The price of being single. Believe it or not, in some parts of colonial America, remaining single could actually cost you money, especially if you were a man. While the idea of a spinster tax on women is more debated and less widespread than bachelor taxes, colonial authorities were certainly creative in finding ways to encourage marriage. Primary goal was often to ensure that everyone contributed to the formation of families which were seen as the backbone of the colony. Single men in particular were sometimes viewed as being unmoored, less stable, and not contributing their fair share to the community's growth and order. Laws imposing fines or higher taxes on unmarried men, often called bachelor taxes or duties, appeared in various colonies at different times. For example, Maryland in 1692 considered a tax on bachelors over 25 years old and on childless widowers. The idea was that these men were shirking their responsibility to marry and raise families which would provide future citizens and workers for the colony. Pennsylvania also had discussions about such measures. In some towns in New England, there were local ordinances or practices that put pressure on single men. For instance, a single man might find it harder to get a land grant or might be subject to closer scrutiny by town officials. The reasoning behind these measures was partly economic and partly social. Economically, families were productive units. They cleared land, farmed and produced goods. Single men, while they could work, were not seen as building the same kind of lasting, economically generative households. Socially, as mentioned before, unmarried individuals were sometimes seen as a potential source of disorder. Forcing them to marry, or at least financially penalizing them for not marrying, was a way to push them towards conformity and social responsibility. Now, what about single women? Direct spinster taxes targeting unmarried women just for being unmarried seem to have been rarer or less formally legislated than bachelor taxes. Women already faced significant economic disadvantages if they were single. However, the legal and economic systems often indirectly penalized single women or made their independent existence difficult. For instance, property laws and inheritance laws often favored men and married women, whose property was controlled by their husbands. A single woman might have fewer protections or opportunities. There's also the concept of femme sole, a single woman who could in some circumstances own property and conduct business. But even these women might face higher scrutiny or informal community pressures. The overall system was designed to support the married state. Any deviation could come with implicit or explicit costs. Consider the way communities handled poor relief. A destitute single woman might become a burden on the town. While communities did provide for the poor, there was often a preference for solutions that involved family structures. If a single woman was seen as able-bodied, but not contributing through marriage and family, she might be viewed less sympathetically. The existence of bachelor fines, even if spinster taxes were less common, sent a clear message. Society valued marriage and procreation. These financial pressures were another tool in the colonial toolkit for managing the population and ensuring that individuals, especially men, fulfilled their expected roles. While a bachelor tax might seem like a straightforward financial penalty, its implications went deeper. It was a public declaration of what society deemed acceptable and desirable. It reinforced the idea that being single, particularly for men of a certain age, was an anomaly that needed to be addressed sometimes through the wallet. For single women, the price of being single was often paid not in direct taxes on their status, but in limited opportunities, social marginalization, and economic vulnerability, a different kind of cost, but a significant one nonetheless. These financial and quasi-financial pressures aim to minimize the number of surplus or unattached individuals by making the single life less attractive or more costly. Number 7. Needle dame school and counter. A woman's work was never done, but limited. For single women in colonial America who needed to support themselves, the options for work were pretty narrow. Society had strong ideas about what was women's work, and these roles were usually extensions of domestic duties or caring professions. Marriage was the main career path envisioned for women, but if that didn't happen, or if a woman was widowed, she had to find a way to survive. The work available was often low-paying and offered little chance for advancement, but it was a lifeline for many. One of the most common occupations for single women was sewing and needlework. This could range from basic mending and making clothes for families to more skilled work like embroidery or mantua making, dressmaking. A woman with good needle skills could work from her own home or go to other people's houses to sew. Advertisements in colonial newspapers sometimes show women offering their services as seamstresses. This was seen as a respectable occupation for a woman, as it fit within the domestic sphere. However, it was often poorly paid, and competition could be stiff. Another path was teaching, usually in what was known as a dame school. These were small, informal schools, often run by women in their own homes. They typically taught young children the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and sometimes religious catechism. Running a dame school provided a small income and a degree of independence for some single women or widows. However, the pay was usually meager, and the status of these teachers was not very high. It was considered suitable work because it involved childcare and basic education, fitting the perception of women's nurturing roles. Domestic service was a major employer of women, including single women. Many young, unmarried women worked as servants in wealthier households. This could involve cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, and any other tasks required by the mistress of the house. While it provided room and board and a small wage, it was hard work with long hours and little freedom. For some, it was a temporary situation before marriage, but for others, it could be a lifelong occupation. The conditions varied greatly, depending on the household. Some single women found niches in retail, though this was less common than other roles. A widow might take over her deceased husband's shop, or a single woman with some capital might open a small store, perhaps selling things like thread, ribbons, basic groceries, or homemade goods. These she merchants, as they were sometimes called, were more common in larger towns and cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston. Operating a shop required business sense and the ability to manage finances, and it offered a greater degree of autonomy than many other jobs available to women. Midwifery was another important role, often filled by women. including some who were single or widowed. Midwives assisted with childbirth and provided postpartum care. This was a highly skilled and respected profession, passed down through apprenticeships. Midwives held a position of authority and trust within their communities. However, it was also a demanding job, with irregular hours and significant responsibility. Apart from these, there were other more piecemeal ways for single women to earn money: spinning yarn, weaving cloth, knitting, selling dairy products or produce from a small garden, taking in laundry, or nursing the sick. Many single women likely engaged in a combination of these activities to make ends meet. The key insight here is that while society heavily pushed women towards marriage, it also had to accommodate, to some extent, those who remained single or became single through widowhood. The economic avenues open to them were restricted by gender norms, but they were not entirely non-existent. These occupations, while often precarious, allowed some single women to maintain a degree of self-sufficiency, however modest. They carved out economic spaces for themselves within a system that was not designed for their independence. This was how many surplus women, in the eyes of some, actually contributed to the economy and managed their own survival. Number 6. Under his wing. Dependence on dads, brothers, or benevolence. For many single women in colonial America, especially those who did not or could not earn an independent living life, was often characterized by dependence on male relatives. In a society where men held most of the legal and economic power, an unmarried woman without her own means was typically expected to live under the care and authority of a male family member. This could be her father, a brother, an uncle, or even a grown son if she was a widow. This system of familial support was the primary safety net. If a woman never married, she would often continue to live in her parents' home, contributing to the household labor. She might take on a significant role in caring for aging parents or helping to raise nieces and nephews, while this provided her with food and shelter. It also meant she was usually in a subordinate position, without much control over her own life or finances. Her labor was essential to the family economy, but she rarely received direct payment or held property in her own name. Upon the death of her father, a single woman's care might fall to her brothers. Wills from the colonial period often show fathers making provisions for their unmarried daughters, perhaps stipulating that a son inherit the family farm on the condition that he provide for his unmarried sister. This could create complex family dynamics. While some brothers undoubtedly cared for their sisters with kindness and respect, the sister was still in a dependent position. Her well-being rested on her brother's goodwill and his own economic stability. This reliance on male kin was deeply embedded in the legal system. English common law, which heavily influenced colonial law, placed women, particularly married women, feme covert, under the authority of their husbands. Single adult women, feme sole, had more legal rights, such as the ability to own property or make contracts, but exercising these rights often required navigating a male-dominated legal and social landscape. Even a femme sole might find it practical or necessary to have a male relative act on her behalf in business or legal matters. What happened if a single woman had no male relatives to support her, or if her family was too poor to provide? This is where community benevolence, or in more formal terms, poor relief, came into play. Colonial towns and parishes had systems for caring for the destitute, based on English poor laws. This could take several forms. Sometimes, a needy single woman might be boarded out with a local family, with the town paying for her upkeep. In other cases, she might receive direct assistance in the form of food, firewood, or money, allowing her to remain in her own dwelling if she had one. As colonies grew, some larger towns began to establish almshouses or poorhouses. These institutions housed various dependents, including the elderly orphans, the disabled and destitute single women. Life in an almshouse was often grim. Conditions could be crowded and unsanitary, and there was a stigma attached to being an inmate. However, for a single woman with no other options, it was a last resort against starvation or homelessness. The expectation of dependence was a powerful shaper of single women's lives. It underscored the societal ideal of women within a family structure, protected and provided for by men. While this system could offer security for some, it also limited autonomy and reinforced gender hierarchies. The surplus single woman, if she could not be integrated into a new family through marriage or support herself through the limited occupations available, was thus absorbed either into the household of a male relative or into the rudimentary welfare system of the community. It was a way of ensuring that unattached women were not left entirely adrift, but it did so by reaffirming their dependent status within the existing social order. This reliance was a fundamental aspect of how colonial society managed the presence of unmarried women. Number 5. Whispers of witchcraft when being alone made you a target. One of the darkest and most terrifying ways colonial society sometimes dealt with women who didn't fit the mold, including some single and widowed women, was through accusations of witchcraft. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but the most well-known example. But witchcraft fears and accusations were present in other colonies as well, both before and after Salem. While not all accused witches were single women, a significant number were, particularly those who were older, poor, or perceived as somehow different or troublesome. In the 17th century, belief in witchcraft was widespread in both Europe and the American colonies. People believed that witches made pacts with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers, which they used to harm others, causing illness, killing livestock, or bringing misfortune to the community. When things went wrong and explanations were scarce, witchcraft sometimes became the go-to scapegoat. Single women, especially those living on the margins of society, could become easy targets for such accusations. Why were single or widowed women often singled out? Several factors might have been at play. Older women, particularly widows, might own property which could make them targets for greedy accusers. Some of these women lived alone, which was unusual, and could breed suspicion in tight-knit communities where everyone was expected to be part of a family unit. They might be skilled in herbal remedies and healing knowledge that could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft if a patient did not recover. If a woman was known for having a sharp tongue, a cantankerous personality, or if she had disputes with her neighbors, these could also contribute to her being labeled a witch. Consider figures like Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in the Salem trials. She was a widow, known for her somewhat flamboyant dress and for running a tavern which sometimes involved unseemly behavior by colonial Puritan standards. Sarah Good, another accused woman in Salem, was a destitute, homeless mother who often begged for charity and muttered under her breath when turned away, which was interpreted as cursing. These women did not conform to the ideal of the quiet, subservient, married woman. The numbers from Salem are stark. Of the roughly 200 people accused, the majority were women. Many of them were middle-aged or older. Some were single. Many were widows. The legal process was heavily biased against the accused. Spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to see the spirit or specter of the accused tormenting them, was often admitted in court. Confessions were sometimes extracted under duress. Those who maintained their innocence and were found guilty faced execution, usually by hanging. 19 people were hanged in Salem in 1692, and several others died in prison. The social and psychological dynamics of witchcraft accusations are complex. They often occurred in communities under stress from economic hardship, disease, or conflict with Native Americans. Fear and anxiety could create an environment ripe for scapegoating. Accusing someone of witchcraft could be a way to explain misfortunes, to settle old scores, or to reinforce social boundaries by punishing those who deviated from the norm. Single women, lacking the protection of a husband and sometimes viewed as anomalous, were particularly vulnerable in such an atmosphere. While Salem was an extreme case, witchcraft accusations and trials happened elsewhere in New England and other colonies like Virginia and Maryland, though usually on a smaller scale. For example, in Connecticut, several dozen witchcraft trials took place between 1647 and 1697, with at least 11 executions. The period of intense witch hunting largely subsided in the colonies by the early 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas began to take hold, and legal standards for evidence became more rigorous. However, the legacy of the witch hunts shows a chilling aspect of how colonial society could deal with those perceived as surplus or problematic, particularly women who did not fit neatly into prescribed roles. Illustrates the dangers faced by women who were economically vulnerable, socially marginal, or simply considered odd in a society that prized conformity and patriarchal family structures. The fear of being labeled a witch served as a powerful, if terrifying, tool of social control. Number 4. The femme sole trader, a glimmer of independence. While many single women in colonial America faced dependence and limited options, there was a fascinating legal status that offered some a pathway to economic autonomy, that of the femme sole or femme sole trader. Under English common law, which formed the basis of colonial legal systems, a married woman, or femme couverte, had her legal identity subsumed by that of her husband. She generally could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or sue or be sued. Her husband controlled her property and her earnings. However, an unmarried adult woman or a widow was considered a femme sole. This status granted her significantly more legal rights. A femme sole could own and inherit property, make wills, sign contracts, run businesses, and importantly, sue and be sued in court in her own name. This legal standing was crucial for any woman who wished to engage in trade or manage her own financial affairs independently. While societal norms still heavily favored marriage, the femme sole status provided a legal framework for those women who by choice or circumstance remained single or were widowed and needed to support themselves. In bustling colonial port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, femme sole traders were a recognized, if small, part of the commercial landscape. These women ran a variety of businesses. Many were shopkeepers, selling goods like textiles, clothing, imported groceries, hardware, or books. Some were tavern keepers or innkeepers, a common business for widows who inherited the enterprise from their husbands. Others were artisans, such as printers, silversmiths, though rare, bakers, or milliners. For example, Clementina Rind took over the Virginia Gazette newspaper after her husband's death in 1773 and became the official printer for the colony. Anne Smith Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's sister-in-law, ran a printing press in Rhode Island. To operate as a femme sole trader, especially if her husband was alive but absent, like a mariner away at sea for long periods, a woman might sometimes need to register officially with local authorities. This custom varied by colony and locality. In Pennsylvania, a 1718 law explicitly recognized the rights of wives of absent husbands to trade as femme sole traders and to be responsible for their own debts. This was a practical measure to ensure that families could be supported and businesses could continue even when the husband was not present. The ability to trade as a femme sole was not a guarantee of success or an easy life. These women faced all the usual challenges of running a business, plus the added complexities of operating in a male-dominated world. They might struggle to get credit, face competition from male merchants, and have to balance business with any domestic responsibilities. However, for those who succeeded, it offered a level of independence and self-sufficiency that was rare for women at the time. Their account books, advertisements in newspapers, and court records provide glimpses into their economic lives. For instance, Elizabeth Timothy became the first female newspaper publisher and editor in America when she took over the South Carolina Gazette in Charleston in 1738 after her husband's death. She successfully ran the paper for several years. The existence of female soul traders shows that colonial society, while overwhelmingly patriarchal, did have mechanisms to accommodate women who needed or chose to operate outside the immediate financial control of a husband. It recognized, at least in a legal sense, that some women were capable economic actors. This status was particularly important for widows, who might otherwise be left destitute. It allowed them to continue family businesses and support themselves and their children. While the number of femme soul traders was not huge compared to the total female population, their stories are significant. They represent an alternative to complete dependence. They were women who navigated the legal and economic systems to carve out a measure of autonomy. This legal provision, the femme soul, was a quiet but important way that society dealt with single women by allowing them, under specific legal definitions, to participate in the economy on their own terms, offering a small but vital space for female enterprise in colonial America. Number 3, for a new life, the frontier. Opportunity. As colonial America grew, the line of settlement was constantly pushing westward. The frontier, that shifting boundary between settled colonial society and the vast, often contested lands beyond, offered a different set of circumstances and for some different kinds of opportunities, including for single women. Life on the frontier was undeniably harsh, dangerous, and isolated, but it could also present a social environment with slightly different rules and greater needs, which sometimes translated into more agency or a higher value placed on women. In many established Eastern settlements, especially in older regions like New England, society was more stratified, and gender roles were more rigidly defined. If there was a local surplus of single women, their prospects for marriage or economic independence might be limited. The frontier, however, often had the opposite demographic issue: a shortage of women. Men, explorers, traders, soldiers, and pioneering farmers frequently outnumbered women in newly opened territories. This imbalance could, in some ways, increase the value of women in these new settlements. A single woman moving to a frontier area, perhaps with her family, or sometimes more rarely on her own, or as part of a group, might find her marriage prospects improved simply due to scarcity. Men eager to establish homesteads and families needed partners. On the frontier, a wife was not just a companion, but an essential economic partner, contributing directly to the survival and success of the household through her labor, farming, gardening, food preservation, making clothes, and managing the domestic sphere under very challenging conditions. Practical skills and resilience of women were highly prized. The journey westward itself was an immense undertaking, filled with peril. Families traveled by wagon, on horseback, or even on foot, over rough terrain, facing threats from weather, wild animals, and sometimes hostile Native American tribes whose lands were being encroached upon. Single women making such a journey would typically be part of a larger family or community group. The shared experience of hardship and mutual dependence on the frontier could sometimes break down some of the stricter social formalities of the East. Once settled, frontier life demanded resourcefulness from everyone. Women often had to take on roles and responsibilities that might have been considered outside their sphere in more settled areas. They might need to defend the homestead, handle tools, or participate in heavy agricultural labor alongside men. This did not necessarily mean they achieved equality, but it could lead to a greater appreciation for their capabilities and a more flexible understanding of gender roles out of sheer necessity. There are accounts of women on the frontier who showed remarkable courage and resilience. Women like Mad Ann Bailey of Virginia, who became a frontier scout and messenger during the Revolutionary War period after her husband's death, became local legends. While such figures were exceptional, their stories hint at the ways the frontier environment could allow or force women to step into unconventional roles. For single women, the frontier could also represent a chance to escape a difficult past social stigma or limited opportunities back east. It was a place where one might, to some extent, reinvent oneself. However, it's crucial not to romanticize the frontier. Life was incredibly hard. Isolation was profound. Medical care was often non-existent, and the threat of violence was real. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Many women died young. The movement to the frontier was one way that the problem of population distribution, including any perceived local surplus of single women, was addressed in a broader sense. It was not a formal policy for relocating single women, but rather a consequence of the larger pattern of colonial expansion. As new communities were established, they sought to repurpose the family-based social structure of the older colonies, and this created a demand for women. For a single woman willing to face the immense challenges, the frontier might have offered a quicker path to marriage and the establishment of her own household, even if that household was a log cabin in the wilderness. It was a stark trade-off, immense hardship for the possibility of a new beginning and a central role in the creation of a new community. Number 2. Serving their time, indentured servitude as a path. For thousands of women, the journey to colonial America began not as a tobacco bride or as part of a migrating family, but as an indentured servant. Indentured servitude was a common labor system in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in colonies like Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Under this system, individuals, both men and women, would sign a contract or indenture, agreeing to work for a master for a set number of years, typically 4 to 7. In exchange, their passage across the Atlantic was paid, and they received food, clothing, and shelter during their term of service. For many poor single women in England, Ireland, or Germany, indenture offered a chance, however slim, to escape poverty and seek a new life in America. The proportion of female indentured servants varied, but they were a significant minority of the total. Many were young, typically in their late teens or early 20s. Their experiences as indentured servants could be incredibly harsh. Legally, they were bound to their masters, and their lives were largely controlled by them. Masters could discipline their servants, and the terms of the indenture could be extended for misbehavior, such as running away, or for female servants becoming pregnant. Female indentured servants often performed domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and childcare. If their master was a farmer, they might also be expected to do agricultural work. The workload was heavy, and the conditions could be poor. They were vulnerable to mistreatment and abuse, with limited legal recourse. If a female servant became pregnant, she faced severe penalties. Not only would her term of service likely be extended sometimes by several years to compensate her master for the loss of her labor during and after pregnancy, but she also faced public shame and fines. The child born to an indentured servant was often bound to serve until adulthood. Despite these hardships, indenture was for some a temporary status. At the end of their term, servants were granted freedom dues. These varied but might include a new set of clothes, some tools, a portion of corn, and occasionally a small parcel of land, though land grants became less common over time. For a single woman completing her indenture, freedom meant she was now on her own to make her way in colonial society. One of the primary prospects for a newly freed single woman was marriage. Given the gender imbalances in many colonies, especially in the earlier periods, her chances of finding a husband could be relatively good. Marriage offered a path to stability and a new social identity. Some former indentured servants married former indentured men, while others might marry small farmers or artisans. However, their past as a servant could sometimes carry a social stigma. The system of indentured servitude played a crucial role in populating the colonies and providing labor. From the perspective of dealing with single women, it was a mechanism that brought many of them to America. It was not a system designed for their benefit, but rather to meet the labor demands of the colonies. Yet, it inadvertently provided an avenue for thousands of single European women who might have had few prospects at home to start new lives in America. Their journey was one of servitude and often suffering. But for those who survived their term, it offered the possibility of a future that could include marriage, family, and a degree of independence they might never have achieved otherwise. The numbers involved were substantial. Historians estimate that as many as half to two-thirds of all white immigrants to the British colonies before the American Revolution came as indentured servants. Many of these were single women. Their labor was vital to the colonial economy, and their eventual freedom and integration into colonial society contributed to its growth and demographic makeup. Their stories are a stark reminder of the harsh realities faced by many who sought a new beginning in the New World, and how their unfree labor was a key component in the colonial enterprise. For single women in this system, servitude was the price of passage and the first chapter in their American story. Number 1. Thornbacks and ancient maids living with the labels. In colonial America, a society that placed such a high premium on marriage and family, the woman who remained unmarried into her late 20s and beyond faced not just social pressure, but also a set of distinct and often unflattering labels. These terms reflected the prevailing attitudes towards long-term spinsterhood and revealed how society tried to categorize and understand women who existed outside the dominant marital norm. Living with these labels was a reality for a segment of the female population. One of the most common terms was spinster. Originally, this was a neutral term, simply denoting a woman who spun thread or yarn, a common female occupation. However, over time, and particularly by the 18th century, spinster became the standard legal and social term for an unmarried woman, especially one past the common marrying age. While not inherently derogatory in its formal usage, it appeared in legal documents and census records, it came to carry connotations of being unchosen or left behind. More pointed, and certainly less kind, were terms like old maid or ancient maid. These labels were used colloquially to describe women perceived as having missed their chance at marriage. They often carried a sense of pity, sometimes mixed with ridicule or even suspicion. The old maid was a figure in popular culture, sometimes depicted as fussy, eccentric, or embittered by her unmarried state. These stereotypes served to reinforce the idea that marriage was the only path to female fulfillment. An even harsher term, particularly prevalent in New England Puritan culture, was thornback. This rather unpleasant label was typically applied to a woman who remained unmarried by the age of 25 or 30. The imagery of a thornback ray, a fish covered in sharp spines, suggested someone prickly, difficult, or unappealing. Being called a thornback was a clear social judgment, indicating that a woman was considered past her prime for marriage and perhaps a burden or an anomaly in the community. Reverend John Cotton, a prominent minister in 17th century Boston, reportedly used the term, highlighting how even religious leaders could employ such stigmatizing language. Living with these labels could be challenging. Single women had to navigate a social world where their status was constantly remarked upon and often viewed negatively. They might be excluded from some social activities geared towards couples or families. They could be subject to gossip and speculation about why they had not married. Some undoubtedly internalized these societal views and felt a sense of failure or inadequacy. However, not all single women passively accepted these labels or lived lives of quiet despair. Some carved out meaningful existences for themselves. As discussed earlier, some found economic independence as femme sole traders, teachers, or in other occupations. Others became vital members of their extended families, caring for relatives, helping to raise children, or managing households for widowed brothers or fathers. These roles, while not conferring the status of a wife, allowed them to contribute and find a sense of purpose. Some single women formed strong bonds of friendship and mutual support with other women, creating female-centered households or networks. There are glimpses in letters and diaries of these rich female relationships. In a few instances, particularly among wealthier or more educated women, remaining single might have offered a degree of freedom from the demands of marriage and childbearing, allowing them to pursue intellectual or religious interests more fully. The very existence of these labels, spinster, old maid, thornback, shows that colonial society had to acknowledge and categorize women who did not marry. While the labels were often negative and aimed at encouraging conformity to the marital norm, the women who bore them found various ways to live their lives. Some may have lived quietly within family structures, while others found niches of independence or alternative forms of community. Their experiences were diverse, but they all had to contend with a culture that had a very specific and often unforgiving vocabulary for women who remained, for whatever reason, outside the bonds of matrimony. These labels were the everyday social consequence of being a surplus, or, more accurately, an unmarried woman in a world that revolved around marriage.